what are your personal views on cannabis overall, whether it should be legalized or I
Yeah,
mean, you kind of have touched on
absolutely.
it, but yeah.
I mean, it'd be weird if I was working for Green Queen
Yeah,
magazine and I was
sure.
like, actually, you know what? I hate weed. I hate it. No, I don't.
Sure. When I was looking at the Green Queen magazine, though, I didn't see the words legalized specifically. I saw decriminalized, so I was wondering if there was like a
Well,
distinction at all there.
yeah, there's definitely a distinction.
Sure.
And I think, yeah, I mean, decriminalization, legalization, they kind of go hand in hand, but they are technically different things. I personally am very pro legalization in all its forms. Actually, I'm a very strong believer in like the Portugal
Mm,
model, because it's like the evidence is there, it works, right? Decriminalizing substances and taking people out of that cycle of becoming, criminals in the system, or like in the eyes of the system, when they, end up, and the thing is that the percentage of people who do drugs, who, you know, do any kind of recreational drug in their lifetime is huge, and it's
Yeah.
naive to think otherwise. It's naive to think that, you know, teenagers at parties don't do a line of coke or cat or whatever. Like, and I know it's not, something that people want to hear maybe, but it happens,
yeah.
and it's gonna happen, and we might as well make it safe, right? We might as well make sure that these things are regulated, and if your kid's going to take ketamine, that at least it's not like laced with fentanyl. Do you know what I mean? Like
Mm,
it's about harm reduction a lot of the time as well. That's kind
Yeah.
of a big word, a big buzzword, and the space that I'm in, harm reduction, and kind of you have to, yeah, I'm sure some people would just be like, would love to see a world where there's no substances, where, everyone's just clean, and but realistically, no one is. Like, even if you don't do drugs, you'll still, like, have a glass of wine, you'll have some, like, you'll smoke a cigarette, it's weird how we've decided to draw the line, how we've decided
Mm.
to be like this arbitrary, like, okay, so alcohol and tobacco is fine, but cannabis isn't. And even though really cannabis is safer anyway, but if you are going to treat cannabis like that, then why is alcohol legal? And actually, this is something that's like quite interesting. There's a guy called Outlaw. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's like a Manchester-based cannabis activist,
Mm.
and he is doing some really, really interesting stuff around that. So like talking about how, like, he's basically suing the government, right? which is a bit of an undertaking,
really?
but yeah. So
What's he suing them
it's
for?
all on his. So basically, for the fact that the legislation surrounding cannabis right now is not in the public interest,
Right.
and his main argument is that you either make alcohol illegal and go back to like prohibition time, or you got to legalize cannabis. You can't have alcohol being legal and cannabis being illegal, because it
Yeah.
just makes absolutely no sense. Like, from like like evidence-based point of view, you look
Yeah.
at the amount of people who die from like liver cirrhosis, whose lives are ruined by alcohol, and then you say, oh, you have a spliff, you're a criminal. Like, any sane person would think that that's ridiculous. I don't understand how our law enforcement, or how our just legislators in general, see that that's like, think that that's right, that that's how it should be. And yeah, I don't know, I just get really angry about it.
Yeah.
So
It's miseducation, isn't it? From the most part. I mean,
oh, 100%.
the policy surrounding, I would argue, almost all drugs, but particularly cannabis, has come from a position of conning policymakers, conning the public, and has major sort of racist undertones, particularly when you look at sort of cannabis criminalization in the US and the lobbying against the hemp industry and against the cannabis industry. From its origins, it comes from a place of not understanding the drug, not understanding the impacts of the drug. All education I had in school on all drugs was that if you do them, you're putting your life in danger and that you should avoid them at all costs. And that's just such nonsense. And you can't
Yeah.
create policy, like you were saying, by turning a blind eye to what the facts are. And that's what we've done. And the drug policy, particularly cannabis policy, and I'd be interested to know your sort of thoughts on other drugs, but particularly cannabis policy has done so much more harm than it has good. And it is so
Yeah.
obvious to anybody that spends 10 minutes researching areas that have legalized cannabis. Legalizing
Mm-hmm.
cannabis not only makes the drug itself safer, makes the consumption safer, you would also majorly decimate gang violence in this country. If cannabis was legalized, it would go a long way to fighting the gang
county lines,
county lines issues,
problem.
That have destroyed so many people's lives. And that's the real issue. Legalization actually solves a lot of the problems that billions of pounds have been spent into fighting over the last I don't know how long, 40, 50 years. So it's
any argument once you start taking it apart, it just falls on its back.
Yeah,
like
it does,
any argument that it is kind of in support of like criminalizing cannabis, it just, as soon as you start slightly unpicking it, it just falls apart. Like regardless of which way, even if you take the worst case scenario, even if you say, okay, fine, cannabis might have like some dangers or risks or whatever, even then that it goes back to the whole alcohol thing. Like okay, then fine, if we're gonna be a nanny state, criminalize alcohol.
Yeah.
Right. If we're gonna go and say, oh, okay, we know better, we know what's, and I'm not even talking about the countless people whose lives change for the better, like with chronic conditions, kids with like drug-resistant epilepsy, people with chronic debilitating pain, cancer patients who are on chemotherapy and they're constantly violently sick, and they take cannabis and they can eat a meal for the first time in weeks. Like stuff like that, and I'm like, this is, and it's just ridiculous. But also, you said about like why it is the way it is. Like, yeah, for sure, I agree. Like a lack of education, things like even like medical practitioners not knowing what the endocannabinoid system is and stuff like that. Like it's just not being in the curriculum. But also, dare I say it, racism, right? If you look at the term marijuana, okay, like it's I've like had to unlearn using that word because
me too.
It's actually incredibly racist, but it's so entrenched in like, because it was used basically in like the whole anti-Mexican like anti-drugs campaign in America, and then it's kind of entrenched itself. But marijuana is just not a word that we should be using. But then like and then disproportionately Black youths being targeted for cannabis possession as well. Like if I'm walking around with a spliff, or if a young Black person is walking around with a spliff, who do you think is going to get stopped? Not me. Do you know what I mean? And it's not, but it's the same substance.
Yeah, and the fact that it's from a moral standpoint that we even criminalize a plant is so ridiculous. When you get down to it. But like you say, for those that don't know, the original anti-cannabis campaigns, that were started in the US that were aimed at Mexicans were started because the hemp industry was growing at such a rate that people workers in the paper industry were going to go out of business, and to combat that, this campaign was started, and I can't remember the exact name, but it's like it was marijuana mania or something along those lines. This campaign that was targeted towards Mexican men predominantly, and the argument was that Mexican men are smoking marijuana, this crazed drug, and they're going to come over and they're going to rape young white American women. That was the argument, the propaganda campaign that was put forward, and that became so deeply entrenched within society. People believed that that's what this plant, that's what the effects of this plant were, and it was an existential crisis to the US, and it was made illegal, and it has stayed that way ever since. That's how ridiculous the criminalization of the plant is, and